President Trump just ripped the brakes off the entire federal bureaucracy, and what happens next is going to shock you. For over 50 years, Washington has been quietly strangling American innovation with mountains of red tape that nobody talks about. But that all ended yesterday when Trump signed an executive order that basically tells the regulatory state to get out of the way. And folks, if you want to stay updated on exactly how this changes everything, hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to show you is going to make a lot of powerful people very uncomfortable. The regulatory avalanche nobody talks about. Now here's something that should terrify every single American. Right now, at this very moment, there are approximately 188,000 pages of active federal regulations sitting in the Code of Federal Regulations. To put that in perspective, if you tried to read just 1 page per minute for 8 hours a day, it would take you an entire year to get through all of them. And here's the kicker. American businesses spend roughly $1.9 trillion every single year just trying to comply with these regulations. But what makes this even more insane is that nobody in Washington can actually tell you what half of these regulations even do anymore. The Small Business Administration found that regulations cost small firms with fewer than 50 employees about $12,000 per employee annually just in compliance costs. Meanwhile, large corporations with over 500 employees only pay about $9,000 per employee. President Trump looked at this nightmare and basically said, enough is enough. But here's what nobody is telling you about how deep this problem actually goes: the hidden tax that's stealing your money. Most Americans have no idea that federal regulations function as a completely invisible tax on everything they buy. When you go to the grocery store and wonder why a gallon of milk costs what it does, or when you're paying your electricity bill and can't figure out why it keeps climbing, a massive chunk of that is regulatory compliance costs being passed directly to you. The Competitive Enterprise Institute calculated that regulatory costs add up to roughly $15,000 per household every single year. Let me break this down even further. Every single time a trucking company has to comply with new electronic logging device mandates, that cost gets added to shipping. When that shipping cost goes up, the store raises prices. When energy companies have to meet arbitrary emission standards that have nothing to do with actual air quality, your power bill jumps. The National Association of Manufacturers found that regulatory costs make up about 20% of the total cost of manufacturing in the United States, compared to just 12% in other developed countries. So, while politicians stand up and promise to fight for working families, they've been slowly bleeding those same families dry through regulations that nobody voted for and most people don't even know exist. But what Trump just did exposes something even more corrupt about who's really been profiting from this system: the billion-dollar consulting industry feeding off regulations. Here's a dirty secret that Washington desperately doesn't want you to know about. There's an entire industry of regulatory consultants, compliance firms, and specialized lawyers who make billions of dollars every year helping companies navigate the regulatory maze. The compliance consulting industry alone is worth over $50 billion annually in the United States. These aren't people producing anything. They're not innovating. They're not building. They're literally just helping businesses figure out how to follow rules that shouldn't exist in the first place. And guess where a lot of these consultants come from? Former government regulators who spent years writing these exact regulations now get hired by private firms at massive salaries to help companies comply with the rules they created. It's the most perfect scam ever designed. A bureaucrat spends 20 years at the EPA or the Department of Labor creating complicated regulations, then retires and immediately gets hired by a consulting firm for 3 times their government salary to explain those same regulations to confused businesses. Meanwhile, small businesses that can't afford these expensive consultants just get crushed. They either shut down, get acquired by larger competitors who can handle the compliance costs, or they never start in the first place because the barrier to entry is just too high. But the real question is, what happens to all those regulations when someone actually tries to get rid of them? The permanent bureaucracy that nobody can fire. This is where it gets really interesting, folks. Most Americans think that when we elect a new president, that person can actually change how the government operates. But here's the reality. There are approximately 2.1 million civilian federal employees, and the vast majority of them have civil service protections that make them virtually impossible to fire. These are the people who write the regulations, enforce the regulations, and benefit from the regulations continuing to exist. The Office of Personnel Management reports that the federal government fires less than 0.5% of its workforce annually for poor performance. In the private sector, that number is closer to 3%. What this means is that federal agencies are filled with employees who know they can't be fired, who have no pressure to improve efficiency, and who actively resist any attempts to streamline or eliminate regulations. When Trump or any president tries to cut regulations, these career bureaucrats slow walk the process, create new interpretations of old rules, or simply refuse to implement the changes. There's actually a term for this in Washington. The permanent federal workforce outlasts every elected official and maintains the status quo no matter who's in charge. These employees donate overwhelmingly to one political party. They live in the same handful of counties around Washington, D.C., and they've built an entire culture around expanding government power. But what Trump figured out is that there's one part of this system that's even more corrupt than the bureaucrats themselves: the regulatory capture that betrays Americans. Now we're getting to the real heart of the problem. There's a phenomenon called regulatory capture that almost nobody outside of economic circles talks about, but it explains everything wrong with our current system. Regulatory capture happens when the industries that are supposed to be regulated essentially take over the regulatory agencies themselves. The people writing the rules used to work for the companies being regulated, or they're planning to work for those companies after they leave government. Take the pharmaceutical industry as a perfect example. The FDA approval process is so expensive and time-consuming that it costs roughly $2.6 billion and takes over 10 years to bring a new drug to market. Who can afford that? Only the massive pharmaceutical companies, small biotech startups that might develop breakthrough treatments, simply can't compete, because the regulatory burden is designed to favor the giants. The big pharmaceutical companies actually lobby for more regulations because they know it keeps smaller competitors out of the market. The same thing happens in telecommunications, energy, finance, and basically every other heavily regulated industry. The regulations aren't written to protect you. They're written to protect market share for the companies that are already dominant. When you see a major corporation supporting new regulations, it's not because they've suddenly become ethical. And there's one more piece to this puzzle that makes the whole system even more sinister: the foreign advantage built on American regulations. Here's the part that should make every American absolutely furious. While we're strangling our own businesses with nearly 200,000 pages of regulations, our foreign competitors are operating in countries with a fraction of that regulatory burden. China has been eating our lunch in manufacturing for decades, and yes, part of that is cheap labor, but a huge part of it is that Chinese manufacturers don't have to deal with the regulatory nightmare that American manufacturers face. American companies are literally moving their operations overseas, not just for cheaper labor, but to escape American regulations. When a factory closes in Ohio and reopens in Vietnam, everyone blames trade deals, but the reality is that the regulatory environment made it impossible to stay profitable in the United States. We've essentially regulated away our competitive advantage. Countries like Singapore, Switzerland, and even parts of Eastern Europe have figured out that lighter regulations attract business investment, create jobs, and grow their economies. The result is that Americans are working harder for less money, while our own government makes it easier for foreign competitors to win. And now Trump is finally saying what needed to be said decades ago. Either we remove these brakes on American competitiveness, or we accept permanent economic decline as our future. And so, folks, that's exactly why Trump ripping out these regulatory brakes isn't just another policy change. It's a complete reset of how America competes in the world. If you found this information valuable and want to stay ahead of what's really happening in Washington, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now, because the establishment media isn't going to tell you any of this. The choice is yours. Stay informed or stay in the dark.